Well, welcome. Can you hear me okay? I'll take that as yes. Okay. So I'm going to test your sleepiness level for this afternoon by starting off with a few stats. Since this is about future farmers and eaters, we'll talk about eaters too, I just wanted to give you some statistics that you may or may not know. From the 2012 census of the National Agricultural Statistics Service, the average age of farmers in America is 58. And that, it has been greater than 50, the average, since 1974. What's more is that 31% of the principal farm operators, 31%, are 65 and older. Now, only 17% of the farms in 2012 met the definition of a beginning farm. 17%, with only 6.7% of the total production of food from these beginning farmers. And then finally, and this may be the most startling statistic, is that there were 20% fewer beginning farmers in 2012 than there were 5 years previously. So it doesn't seem like it's the best trending for beginning and young farmers. So this is where we enter, and we're going to try to talk about how to get to advocate for young farmers and eaters, and what the role eaters play in this as well. And we've got a great panel. And really, I just want to open it up first with a problem that I understand hits a lot of young and beginning farmers, which is land costs. This is something, I mean, as we all know, land costs keep going up, and it's impossible, maybe not impossible, but hard for young farmers to A, secure land, and then B, if they do secure it, they're able to make a profit from their work. And there seems to be a call for policy here, and I'm wondering if any of you have ideas on how government or nonprofits or anyone can help secure land for young farmers. Anyone?
I guess I'll start.
Yeah.
I'm on the DC Food Policy Council. And one thing the DC Food Policy Council is doing right now is working with government officials to implement the Urban Farm and Food Security Act. What this bill does is if a person can identify a plot of land in DC, they would get a 90% tax abatement. It's like a 90% tax cut if they're growing on that piece of land. And so DC actually passed this bill in 2015, but is yet to be implemented properly. So there are a lot of young people and also just residents in general who don't know about the bill. So what the DC Food Policy Council is doing right now is working with the DC government to implement this bill to ensure we have funding in the budget so we can do outreach so people can know about the bill, as well as working with the government to identify pieces of land that people can actually grow on. And one thing I would love to see the DC Food Policy Council do in the future is actually help people, especially young people, from beginning to end, to identify the land, help them grow on the land, and help them actually sustain growth and maybe even sell it. So.
I'm curious, would this be giving the land to them, or would it just be giving them access to the land for a little bit of time, which seems to me like it would just be a short-term solution, right? Because eventually they'll activate the area, and then developers will come in and say, nice job, I'll take that from you.
So right now it definitely is a short-term solution because land is very scarce in the city. But hopefully, through the Food Policy Council, we can make it a long-term solution. We can say, as long as you're growing and selling on this land, you should be able to keep the land. And that's an amendment that I'd love to see introduced through the council, hopefully down the road. So.
Can I offer a slightly different example?
Yeah, of course.
So I work at Stone Barns, and we're in a peri-urban context, and there are a couple of things that I see happening that are exciting and interesting. One is some of the young farmers who apprentice with us are helping us manage a piece of land that belongs to the state of New York. And our hope is that this will be a great example of how conservationists managing parkland and people working in agriculture or farmers can come together to create great stewardship solutions. So it's a grassland that's a little bit beaten down. We're hoping through multi-species rotational grazing we can kind of help restore this park. And the state hopes this will be a case study that they can use to open other public lands to young farmers who are looking for spaces to work. So it's a exciting
Do you know
partnership
how
with
like
state
the
government.
finances work when you open up public land, like the arrangements between the farmers and the state?
I mean, it depends. There are quite a few national scale arrangements. The Cuyahoga Valley's another example in Ohio. Our arrangement with the state of New York is we are paying the management costs so they don't have to mow,
Yeah.
maintain trails, maintain fencing. The farmers who are working the land are taking care of some of those infrastructure costs and are not paying a very high lease price. They're paying a little bit of cash, but it's very, very low in particular for that area.
So it sounds potentially profitable then for the farmers.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see. It's year one, but yes, I mean, the budget or the plan looks very good, that within 18 months they could be turning some profits. So.
And Mailee, I know you, your foundation has sort of like an emerging leaders and critical issues programs. Does it, help? Are there any sort of programs that you have helped with the young farmers?
I wish I could say yes, and I can't. And so I run a foundation. So my perspective isn't me doing the work, but really sharing the stories of the organizations that we support, including Regina's organization. And what I've seen, less of a policy, so I'm not a policy expert, but just listening to the stories, is that is such a critical issue. And so we've supported organizations both in urban spaces and in more rural spaces. And in urban spaces, there have been organizations, what they called guerrilla farming. So nobody cared about the land, they took it, and they're just taking that risk that hopefully the city doesn't take it back. There have been other times where the city did say, hey, go ahead and take this, we don't want this, and then all of a sudden they did want a development to come. And so the community really had to write letters and really advocate to keep this plot of land, because then it became much more than about food, but about community. And then in rural areas, I think what we found, our land trusts have started to say, hey, maybe take some of our land and use it for farming. Or there's an organization called Soulfire Farm where they really look to dismantle racism in the food system. And so there's one example where there was a white family who had land, and then they understood the historical racism that happened on how they even got the land in the first place, and then offered some of their land to some Black emerging farmers. So the stories I have to share are less policy, but more what people are trying to do on the ground, both the struggles and the opportunities too.
And I will say from our perspective, we had our national conference for our students across the country in early November, which I definitely want to give a shout out to all the students across the country that I know are listening today, and my team in the audience. I had the opportunity to ask them, who here wants to be a farmer? And about a third of the hands went up. And I also say, when I asked, who here wants to, run for government or work in policy, about a third of the hands went up. And the other third were people who wanted to start their own businesses. So, we do see a lot of young people who have an interest in farming, and they are just about to launch into those kinds of opportunities. We see a lot of our students who are interested in the share economy. So some of the examples that I've seen are, and just here in DC too, that Jeremiah I'm sure is aware of, but thinking about our older communities that maybe they have a home with a lot of land, but they're maybe too old to continue to have their own garden plots. Well, when you connect them with young people, they can actually tend to gardens on people's property. And I love seeing so many classes that are coming up on how to be a farmer when you just have a relatively small amount of land to produce food and how to sell that into a marketplace. Young people are able to do that with those kinds of relationships. Beekeeping is the same thing. When people just offer up their space that they aren't able to utilize fully to people who are willing. It's such a great relationship.
Well, I think one of the things with young farmers is, they don't know what they don't know yet. And, all of us, when we start a job, it's like it's a learning process, right? There's much to learn and a short amount of time sometimes to learn it. And I'm wondering, like, if you had advice to give for young farmers, like, where would you begin to help them out? It's like, is there government resources still? I know that, obviously the USDA is getting more cutbacks now. Where do you turn to for financing? Where do you turn to for, just basic agricultural help? Like, where are the resources now for young farmers?
So there's one organization called the Carrot Project, and that's what they're trying to do is provide loans where maybe you wouldn't, quote unquote, qualify from the government. And again, it's a nonprofit, so it couldn't service the country, but there are, I think, examples like that, much more small and much more disparate throughout. I don't know if you have other examples.
I mean, the piece of advice I would give is find a really good mentor. So we have the opportunity to work with lots of very seasoned farmers, and we have a big young farmers program. And the elders really want to work with these young people who want to be growers. And, people like Amico Bob Contasano and Elliot Coleman, they're like, I want to help create, a farm community in the region that I'm in, and I really want to work with these young people who are struggling to find land, to find tools, to figure out what grows well in this environment. So, and a lot of them have utilized government programs at the local, state, and federal level for their own farming operations. So I'd say go to the elders and ask
Right.
for help.
Jeremiah, did you have something?
I definitely agree with that. I think, even in the city, there's a lot of veteran urban gardeners, there's a lot of veteran farmers that a lot of young people should go to for advice. I will also add, I think, that the University of District of Columbia, land-grant college, should have a mentorship program for young farmers, even making it very robust, working with high school students, too. And so I definitely think, hopefully, maybe through the Food Policy Council, or just me as an advocate, I would love to, push to hopefully get UDC to have like a really robust mentorship program for young people in the city. So,
I'm wondering, like, how much education do young farmers need on just what to grow? And, like, you have to find a market for your products, right? It's almost like rule number one. You can't grow something that no one wants. And so how do you begin to understand what to grow? I mean, Jill, you talked a little bit about you need to know what grows well in your area, but like what's sellable? Where can you sell? And what role then do eaters play in helping farmers? So let's tackle this subject.
I will say I had the opportunity to visit an organic farm outside of Philadelphia several months ago, and it was wonderful. It was about 24 acres, so technically not that big. I thought it was huge. They had chickens and pigs and all kinds of different plants and things that they were working on. And maybe back to the advice piece, the farmer, he was actually a manager of the land. He didn't own the land. He just helped the family who owned it to make it valuable. He said, being a farmer is kind of like playing chess. At any one time, you have about 30 different plants and vegetables that you're trying to hopefully get to the finish line. You're going to have a crop failure. It's absolutely going to happen, and you just have to, learn what you can from that. And also, I think to your point about the role that the eaters have, just when you go to a farmer's market, I think a lot of the reasons why we all like to go to them is because you have an opportunity to talk to people about, why is this, radish black? What is this new kind of variety? I've never seen it before, and what am I supposed to do with it? So you can kind of lead the conversation around, this is what we have to offer, and here's why, because it happens to grow really well in our area. Maybe this is an heirloom that people used to use all the time, and for whatever reason, people stopped using it. And so I think it just opens up a really wonderful arena for good conversation.
So when I started at the foundation 10 years ago, I had no background in food. And I remember looking at the website and looking at the different issue areas because I was applying for my job, and I thought, oh, education I get, environment makes sense, community development, that was my background, and then I saw food and I said, is this like a niche topic? Why do they care about food? And 10 years later, it's really transformed who I am personally. The question I had 10 years ago was, how can you make sense for the farmer to get a fair price and for the average American who is trying to struggle every day? And I have to tell you, 10 years later, I still have that question. And so I don't know what the answer is, but if there's something that keeps me up at night, that's the question. And then how can we have it safe for the environment? I don't know. And what I do know is that in organizations that we support, many of them are on the hunger side. So they tell me, Mailee, I want to feed people. You know what? If it has to come from corporate farms, so be it. This family has to eat at night. Or they might wave more on the farmer side, that the farmers, you know what? They need to make a living too. And so yes, maybe their produce does go to high-end restaurants, but we need to support the farmers. But to find that middle piece is really hard. And so I actually came to this panel with that question because I would love to hear from other panelists and even those in your room, how do we make that, if we can't make that make a market sense, then we'll continue to have double up bucks, which our foundation has supported, but we are subsidizing. Or we'll continue to have farmers who are struggling to make it, but they're not reaching the everyday person. So I don't know what the answer is, but that still, 10 years ago till now, is something that I think about all the time.
How many farmers markets now accept SNAP benefits?
I don't know that number.
I think
I
it,
don't know. I mean,
maybe
they
somebody
do
else
a
in the
growing
audience knows.
number, and what I've seen is there are organizations like Carman Market, which is a food distributor. It's out of Philadelphia, but they've grown to Atlanta, to other places, and there are them all over the country now. And their main goal when they started was to serve low-income communities. Now they've evolved, and they're making ends meet. They're successful. What they found was their ratio is about 75% of their food is going to higher middle income, and then 25% is really going to communities that need it, and that's through institutions. So is that the business model we're looking at? I don't know, but it's an important question.
Can I go back to your question too about
Of course.
the eaters?
Yeah.
So an idea that we're working on and that we like to talk with others about is an idea of what we describe as supply-driven eating or farm-driven cuisine. We need a better marketing term. But our farming program with young farmers is really about training them to look at the place that they're in, look at the land that they're on, and respond to it in a way that, let the land invite you to grow what it wants. So if you're in a place that has really wet springs and a beautiful spring flush, do some grazing. If you're in a place that has a shorter water supply, think about the crops you grow differently. And we're trying to get people to think about kind of the way they eat in a way that responds to that. So maybe I want a tomato in New York in February, but maybe that's not the best thing. Maybe I need to learn to eat a parsnip. So we're really trying to invite eaters and farmers to think together about how all of the things that a farmer needs to grow to create healthy soil and water can be delicious. And a lot of times we at the farm learn from the people who come to our CSA something really, really wonderful that they do with a vegetable that we need because it's a nitrogen fixer, or that we need because it breaks up the soil in the winter so there's proper aeration. So, we're really excited that so many people are so interested in food, and that hopefully as a community we can all work together to have more variety in our diet and a pattern of eating that supports resiliency.
Give me an example. So what would be a good nitrogen replacer in the soil of a crop that you would suggest a farmer make that maybe is not a popular vegetable or fruit in the marketplace?
Well, I'm not going to give you a nitrogen fixer, but I'll give you the one that's hard for me in the winter. So we have all these winter storage crops. So beets, parsnips, things honestly that I don't really love. In the Midwest, as a kid, we used to grow them. They came out, or we'd eat them out of a can in the winter at my grandma's house. They weren't super tasty, but I was with a group of older women a couple of weeks ago, and they make, you know, sliced parsnip steaks that they put just a little bit of gravy from their leftover meat on Sundays on. They're amazing, and they grill them, and so, you know, that came from the need to use those plants when they had backyard gardens and really relied on those gardens to feed their families. So there are some incredible home cooks who have figured out how to make some of these crops that are maybe a little bit less popular in the American diet really, really delicious. So,
is it a hard sell with farmers to grow these in winter, or conversely, like how do you educate the consumer to eat parsnips?
I mean, I don't think it's a hard sell with farmers. And one of the things we're learning with the young farmers we work with is that some of these crops also provide kind of a smoothing to their income, because they are able to sell crops year round or 10 months of the year instead of 8. The home cooks, I think I think that's a big cultural shift that'll take us 50 years for some of the more kind of unusual ingredients that maybe we didn't learn to cook when we were growing up. So I think it's a long-term goal, but people are into it. Cooking's coming back.
Is it?
Is it coming back?
Really?
That question.
Yeah, what's your take on cooking coming back? Some of the data I see, it's not. Like, you look at farmers markets now, right? And there's a lot of prepared foods now, catering to what seems to be a patron that wants to buy something that's maybe prepared with ingredients from a chef that's got a food truck or a stall at the farmer's market.
I mean, I'll say one more thing, and then I'd love to hear from others, but you know, the data that I read about millennials, and the millennials I work with, is they want to do kind of this quasi-cooking. So it's like, give me a box that has the stuff put together for me, but they want to go to the, you know, we live apartment building and cook with their friends, that it's a like socially enriching activity for them and something they're excited about. So maybe I'm off with the data, and it's the audacity of hope here.
Well, I was going to say, for Food Recovery Network, we see a lot of our students who are very interested in doing their own home cooking. And I think, you know, Jill, to your point, it is that maybe some prepared stuff with fresh ingredients. And one example that I love to talk about is Hungry Harvest, which is another organization that was started by students at the University of Maryland, where Food Recovery Network started. And it's a community-supported agriculture box that has, you know, a plethora of fresh vegetables and fruits that people can sign up for. And we have seen a lot of our students in the Hungry Harvest Marketplace sign up for subscriptions to that. And it's been wonderful. And because when we think about what Food Recovery Network is trying to do, is we're actually trying to ensure that all the food that we do grow in this country doesn't go to waste. Because currently, 10 million tons of food that our amazing farmers are growing is either left on the vine, tilled underground. It just doesn't get to the people that we know need it most. So Hungry Harvest is trying to counteract that, as is Imperfect Produce out in California. And a lot of the people who subscribe to those services are young people. At our national dialogue, we had a really fun event called the Kitchen Throwdown that, you know, people who even live in dorms, you know, have access to stoves sometimes, and they had this, you know, wonderful culinary challenge, and I ate some really amazing food because of that. So it was like, you know, people who were just starting to learn how to cook and cut with knives, which was, I looked away for that part, but.
Well, Regina, let me ask you, I know you kind of were just touching upon it now, but the food waste issue. And, you know, farmers markets, which I'm assuming a lot of farmers will want to try to get into, get a good price, they can sell their product, make some more money. Both farmers markets and supermarkets, they tend to like, you know, the perfectly beautiful vegetables and fruits. They don't want blemished ones, they don't want seconds. How do you help farmers? I mean, there's no control, right, over like how beautiful the food ends up looking once it's harvested. How do you help them find markets for these foods that a lot of consumers apparently just don't want?
That's a great question, and something, again, that's, I feel in the space that I'm in every day is a burgeoning area. So there's a few examples, and I'll start with maybe the production side, which is where can we put these seconds that are available. So if you think about tomatoes, if you think about the wonky carrots, all my carrots that I've ever grown are wonky, so I don't know how the carrots in the grocery stores end up so perfectly straight, but I digress. So we work with an organization called Specialty Food Association, and all that they work on is, small jars of really fancy ketchup or tomato sauce or vinegars, whatever it might be. And these are from labels that have maybe 1 million units of distribution. A lot of those companies are using seconds to make their final product. And the market does say, when we use words like upscale, upcycle rather, people are actually willing to pay more for that product, almost as much as they would for organic products. So there is a market out there. When we think about Misfit Juicery, that's definitely using seconds to make their product, and they're doing such a great job. As I mentioned before, the Hungry Harvest and the Imperfect Produce, their whole entire market is around the fruits and vegetables that grocery stores feel that they cannot have in their stores. But that goes back to your point of, what are we all expecting and demanding from our own grocery stores? When we have more education around what things actually look like and where food actually comes from, I think that the demand for that perfect cucumber might start to go down a bit. But because grocery stores realize, when they're sending back a whole entire truckload, this has happened many times, a whole entire truckload of cabbage because there's dirt on it, and it just came from the ground, they're wasting their money. And so they're soon going to figure that out and figure out other areas where they can make money. And luckily, we do have tax enhancements for organizations that recover and donate their surplus food, so they don't have to lose their all of their money if they're not able to use the product for whatever reason it might be.
And there's a great report by REDF. Is it REDF? Or
REFED. Mhm.
REFED, I'm sorry, REFED. I was wondering, I can't spell that in my name. By REFED, I thought, which is great. So if you haven't seen it, it's worth looking up. And what they really looked at was a national plan looking at food waste that nonprofits have used, businesses have used. I've heard that referred by so many nonprofits. Yeah. So if that is an area of interest, it's definitely worth looking up, because it is an area that's growing, both from the private sector as well as from the nonprofit sector. It'll be interesting to see what happens 5 years from now on where that is and where the nonprofits or for-profits have taken a role in that, but it's definitely growing.
There's the coolest ad campaign. I think it's in Britain. It's called Ugly Fruits or Ugly Vegetables, and they dress the vegetables up like people, and it's all the vegetables that are the most deformed or blemished, and kind of present them in this very humorous way and funny way to get the British consumer to consider that it's equally delicious to the perfect looking vegetable. So there's probably some cool marketing work that somebody could take on around this too.
So I wanted to ask about urban agriculture and where young farmers might fit into that. Jeremiah, you talked about it a little bit. And, a part of this, I think we talk about land a lot, but there's obviously a lot of indoor concepts now, taking buildings and doing vertical farming inside. Is this an impossibility for young farmers because the infrastructure costs are so high? Or is there a way to get them to use abandoned buildings that just sit there for years and years, no one wants them, and put them to use?
Yeah, I think in Washington, D.C., I think it's a little bit complicated because, housing is so unaffordable here in the district. And, some of the land that we do have, buildings we do have, a lot of folks want to develop it into housing. But I definitely think instead of a lot of the, just my honest opinion, I think instead of a lot of the luxury condos that we have in the district that are going for $25,000 a year, $25,000 a month in rent, $10,000 a month in rent, that could be put to good use to deal with a lot of food insecurity in the district. So a lot of developers in the city, they're getting big tax abatements, almost 99 years with no tax, paying no taxes. And sometimes they buy property for 50 cents in the district, and they develop they develop, but a lot of it's luxury condos and not affordable housing. So I definitely think we need to change our thinking, and really start to use some of these legislative mechanisms like tax abatements, TIFs, community land trusts, to actually use property to actually grow up, no pun intended, to create vertical farms, because in Ward 8 right now in Washington, D.C., which is majority African American, a lot of folks live below poverty level, they only got one grocery store for like 70,000 people. But there is a lot of abandoned buildings out there, a lot of abandoned property that could be used to create vertical farms, as well as maybe make some hybrid of vertical farms and affordable housing, and so I definitely think there's a lot of possibilities that lie in creating vertical farms. I just really think it takes a change in shift in thinking, like prioritizing people's needs, which are food and housing, over the needs of folks who view land as just being profitable for their own gain. So.
And to Jeremiah's point, before moving to DC, I lived in Pittsburgh for about 7 years, and there was an organization that I love a lot that was actually also started by a student, which called GTech Strategies. And what they did was they started to think about how can we take the abandoned property in Pittsburgh, of which there is plenty. They were doing tax abatements and things like that too. But when we think about, okay, well, that's an abandoned field, let's just grow food there. Well, there's probably a lot of lead and other heavy metals in that soil. So what they did was they planted brassica plants that naturally would leach the toxins out of the soil. It would rest in the stalks of the plant. And when the plant was ready to harvest, they would take the plants, properly dispose of the stalks, and then the flower part they could use for biofuels. It's an amazing program. And as they advanced in what they were trying to do as a startup, they realized that there were lots of jobs to be created in this endeavor. Who was going to harvest the flowers? Once the cycle was completed, what are we going to now do with that land? And they have a really wonderful active jobs program through GTech. So again, it's keeping the land in the hands of the community members, creating jobs for the people in that community, and empowering them to continue to evolve their area, their land in the way that they want to.
Yeah.
I was going to say one more thing. I definitely also think that there's a possibility where every high school can have some type of building or facility where they're growing fruit, vertically growing fruit, and then they're learning about it as well. So we're actually creating new farmers. I definitely think that's an idea that should be explored as well.
Well, so we've talked a lot about farmers and what government maybe can do, or nonprofits or schools. We talked a little bit about what eaters can do. We can eat more ugly fruit. We can, shop at farmers markets, learn to cook. But are there other things that eaters really need to do to get involved and support a new generation of farmers? I mean, it seems like we're getting to an acute point where we're relying on older generation farmers, and we need fresh infusion of farmers. How can all of us here help?
I have to say, again, in the space that I'm in, I think for all of us as eaters, one thing that we could do to help farmers is not throw away the food that they've made for us. and we do that in a variety of ways. And I know Congresswoman Pingree was on earlier today, and she has the date labeling bill that is going to help a lot of us, I think, understand what fresh food still looks like and tastes like, and just giving education to all of us who maybe aren't as knowledgeable about what these dates mean. And is it still good to eat if it's past the use by, sell by dates? We as individuals throw away a tremendous amount of food, and therefore dollars, and also therefore calories. And again, when Jeremiah mentioned the food insecure people in our neighborhoods, it's not just some faraway country where people don't have enough to eat. It's here in DC, it's here in literally every single community. Even those communities of high wealth, there are people who don't have enough to eat. So I would say as eaters, that would be something that we could do. Learn to use your leftovers, learn to love leftovers, and actually maybe almost assume that you're going to have leftovers, especially if you eat out, because until we figure out the portion sizes, which is a whole nother issue, we're gonna have extra food, and we don't have to throw it away. We can learn to use our own surplus food better.
I'll add one personal note here. Because I go out to eat a lot, part of my job, and I always felt guilty about throwing out leftovers or not taking them home. And one thing that I did at the Post was create a channel, an inter-office communication for leftovers. And it started with just a few people, and now it's hundreds of people.
That's
And,
awesome.
and people dig leftovers, like particularly journalists. There's something about journalists and leftovers. They love it. And,
So you like
and
trade?
nothing ever goes to waste. It's like you put it out there and 30 seconds later it's gone.
It's true. I think that's a great idea. We need more of that, Tim, in the world.
The other thing about young farmers, I actually think this was one of the programs that Kathleen Merrigan helped launch at USDA, but the whole idea of know thy farmer. So if you, or know your farmer, showing them appreciation, I think that's something we can all do as eaters. So when you have an opportunity, the young people we work with, I just see them get such a charge out of somebody saying, hey, Phil, I ate your pork and it was the best ever. That's 5 more years in Phil's farming career right there. So.
Well, how many people, everyone knows a farmer that's probably heard this question. It's like, why is this so expensive? Like, I can get this at Safeway for a third of the cost. Like, is this something that we've got to learn just to, I don't know if it's inherent of, obviously we all have budgets to deal with, but like, is there some way to educate that it just costs more to have freshly grown, small lot farming and the agriculture that comes from it?
Well, I don't know if this answers your question, but it reminds me of a story that I was talking to a man where they had a family farm, and I think the grandparents who came from Grist started it, so he was 3rd generation. And so I really wanted to know from his perspective, what's business like now? Has it changed over the generations? And what he said to me, he said, yeah, it has. He said, my parents and my grandparents, they both supplied, and it was all vegetables, so they supplied their vegetables to quote unquote mainstream grocery stores, Kroger, Acme. And he said now what he's noticed, because what they do is they have their vegetables and then companies will say it's a Whole Foods corn, or they'll just put their grocery store in it. He said now their customers are either the dollar store or Whole Foods. So that reflects the growing income disparities in our country, and that's reflected in their products. So again, how do we deal with this? And it's the same corn. So, and it's just interesting, he said, so our business is different. He said those middle line grocers are almost not there. It's on either end, and it's the same corn. So they're selling obviously more expensive to Whole Foods as they are to the dollar store, but that's what they're seeing.
Jeremiah, quickly,
I was going to say,
we want to get to some Q&A here in a minute.
Quickly, we have to sometimes, ask ourselves, why is that person saying this food is so expensive? Sometimes it's because they're probably spending, 10% of their income on housing, 20% of their income on childcare, 10% of their income on utility bills, and then everything else. And so there's so much other things, and especially in the city, they're so expensive now. And then when they get to the $1 corn, they're like, oh my God, it's so expensive, But as advocates, we got to look at the intersectionality between a lot of our issues, food and housing and childcare, and so many other things, and really work to make our city more affordable. So when we go to the farmer's market and we buy a 50-cent or $1 apple, we won't, it's nothing to us, because we have access to childcare, because we have affordable housing, because we have a city run on 100% clean energy, and our utility bills are lower. So we have to look at our other expenses, and then we can possibly say, oh, well, that corn is expensive.
Yeah, that's a great point. So questions. We have 12 minutes. I'd love to get some questions. Yes, there's somebody right here. You with the hand raised, yes?
Hi there. My name is Becky, and I'm an apprentice grower at Bright Farms. So this question is more directed towards Jill. In searching for an apprenticeship, it's really hard to find one that pays you a living wage. And, the barrier to entry for a young farmer that doesn't come from a farming background is often knowledge, and apprenticeships can be really great to bridge that gap and break down that barrier. That being said, a lot of them are very inaccessible for people who can't support themselves on a stipend or sometimes on no pay at all. So I'm curious what you're doing at Stone Barns or anyone else on the panel is doing to sort of bridge that knowledge gap and make this information more accessible, or these apprenticeships more accessible.
Well, a couple things. One, we, through the generous support of others, are able to pay the apprentices who are part of the program at Stone Barns, and we have been working with, as part of a collective in the Hudson Valley with other farms that offer apprenticeships to try to help everybody be able to do that, because we recognize what you just pointed out, which is a lot of first-generation farmers who are really interested in farming as a life and a career. Those first 4 or 5 years of learning, it's like going to graduate school. It's expensive and time-consuming, and you need time to study and be out on the land. And I think that the understanding of that is growing among many people. So my hope is that there will be more and more apprenticeships that kind of put the whole picture together, so that it's an opportunity that's open to anyone who has the passion and the drive to participate in the profession. I don't know what else I would say.
Other question? Way in the back.
Hi, my name is Karen Buxbaum, and I do research around climate change and agriculture adaptation. And I would really love to hear more talk about climate change just in general in agriculture, because climate change really is the single greatest threat to our food system. And in my research, I focus a lot on how can farmers adapt to climate change, but I'm interested in hearing from you all more about the consumer side, because climate change, things tend to happen pretty quickly, and it does take time to get consumers used to eating different types of food like parsnips and things like that. And we're seeing now in like California with slowing down of production of almonds and citrus and avocado, like we're going to eventually have to completely shift certain foods that we're eating. So I was wondering if you all could speak a little to that and how we could maybe expedite or make consumers a little bit more flexible in what they eat, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll say from our perspective, and I think that's a great question, and I'm so awesome that you're doing that kind of research. For us at Food Recovery Network, we are trying to ensure that perfectly good food doesn't get thrown into the landfill, which is the single biggest thing in our landfills across the country. I thought when I first started with Food Recovery Network that it was plastic or metals or diapers, but it's food. And this isn't just, the scraps. This is perfectly edible food. So we work to ensure that when we do have food, it gets into the hands of those who need it most. So there's that. And then a lot of our students also across the country are working directly with farmers to do gleaning initiatives, which is they will go onto the farm and pick the fruits and vegetables that for whatever reason weren't harvested, and we're also able to donate that food. So while we are growing it, we are ensuring that that doesn't become part of the climate issue. So for our students, while food insecurity and food hunger is what drives a lot of our students to do the work that they're doing, there's still an equal amount that are driven by the fact that we are harming our environment by throwing away food, and we can do something about it. And our students said, well, I'm going to take an hour out of my day and do something about it.
I think that's a really important area. And at the Claneil Foundation, we revised some of our grant programs, and one was locally in Philadelphia. Instead of having silos based on feedback that we heard from the nonprofit community, We have one grant program that's the intersection of food, health, and the environment. So to your point, it makes so much sense conceptually, but what's interesting in the second year that we've had that grant program, a lot of the organizations that have come to us for funding have been food and health, very little in the environment space. And that reflects a lot of foundations, and I'm just talking one geographic area, there really aren't a lot of environmental funders. And so I think the work you're doing is very important because it's that environment piece, while we all personally know it's critical, from our little sphere in Philadelphia, it hasn't yet caught up to integrate very well in the food and the health area.
I mean, one thing I would add just from the farming perspective is kind of reinforcing the point that I was making before, which is encouraging people to have a lot of diversity in their diet. So on our farm and with a lot of the farmers we work with, we're experimenting with many, many, many different varieties of seed to see, is it resilient in the climate we're in? And we're learning all kinds of things about, like, this does better when we have a longer cold season, this does better in, you know, a wetter spring, and we're able to communicate that to farmers so that they can adapt their crop planning accordingly. But that calls for a consumer that's willing to be flexible and open to eating different things or having more diversity in their diet. If you have a weather year that demands that you grow something that's a little different than what you grew last year.
Great. There's a question right here in the middle.
Philip Bogdanoff with Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. I'm aware of three sort of growing networks of donor-advised funds, impact investors. There's Iroquois Valley Farms, there's Standard Soil, and Grasslands. I'm wondering if any of you are aware of those and have any comments on what they're trying to do to bridge, help build the regenerative agricultural movement, but also help young farmers overcome some of the financial obstacles that they're encountering.
I'm not familiar with those organizations, but I definitely plan on looking into them. I'm sure folks on my team, which is right in front of me here, might have heard of them. Because when we're always trying to learn about new organizations that are doing things, especially around biodiversity, that we can share with our network. So I'll definitely look into that. So thank you for letting me know about that.
I've heard of Iroquois Valley. Is it Iroquois Valley you're talking about? I like the concept, and I don't know, I've actually seen several concepts that are similar, and probably 6 or 8 companies that are investing in land and then hopefully trying to create very favorable lease arrangements or options to buy for farmers. So I like the idea. It does seem like there's a sweet spot that could make the land more accessible for the farmer and also be a viable business model for folks to take advantage of the massive land turnover that we're going to be facing as a country. So it'll be interesting to see over the next 10 years the feedback that farmers give about their experiences. I like it.
Got a few minutes left. Let's see if we can get 2 more questions in. Right here.
Hi, my name is Max Johansen. I'm here on behalf of Busboys and Poets. This question is principally for the two of you. You briefly touched on the visibility and desirability of prepared foods instead of fresh foods to today's consumer. It's a two-parter. One, when it comes to things like you mentioned, fresh ingredients in prepared foods, like value-added foods, like canned foods, preserved foods, jams, pickles, those kinds of things, is that a real viable revenue stream for young farmers? And what kind of programs are currently in place to encourage people to explore those kind of revenue streams? Either one.
When do you have me?
Yeah,
I mean, I think there are a lot of really interesting incubators in cities across the country. I mean, there are many in New York. I participated with a group in California called the Foodcraft Institute, which was nonprofit that worked on training folks to make value-added product, whether it was coffee roasting or jamming or pickling. And it was a great program because they worked on the culinary side, but they also worked on the entrepreneurial side. So I've seen like really inspirational, creative things happening where people are marrying business skills with kind of the crafting, and you know, you see it in the craft brewing industry, and I think there's a lot of really cool opportunity, and that stuff is so much fun and so delicious, and so.
When you see a lot of food incubators,
Yeah.
popping up in
Yes.
cities too, and they help these people find farmers for their ingredients.
Yeah, and they're some of them are like shared workspaces now, so it's very affordable for a startup business. But I feel like it's a place where there's a lot of really great creative energy.
But
I don't know about DC.
I remember reading, and a colleague told me this, I think with the food incubators, and to your question, can you make a viable salary out of it? I don't know if that's been answered, and I know food incubators have kind of come and go and have had, mixed reviews as far as success in them. I mean, that's all I can share on that from what I've read and what I've known, so.
So it's still up in the air.
That's what I have learned so far.
It's like any small business startup, right?
Yeah, it's hard, yeah.
They're pretty risky. 80% fail or something.
I was really excited to read about an incubator outside of it, well, I guess inside of Atlanta. I'm not overly familiar with the city, but what was neat about that particular incubator was we have a mess hall here in DC and Union Kitchen that helps varying degrees of size of people who want to start these kinds of businesses. This company, it started to support people who were in the lower income community of Atlanta. So these are the folks that we often don't think about as having jobs or that they're just not doing things creatively, but a lot of times people are going from shop to shop in their own community, selling their cookies or selling their herbs, whatever it might be. And so this particular incubator is all about supporting people who are in their community, are low income themselves, but are entrepreneurs. So I was really excited to read about that.
Yeah, like my friend right here said, I don't know if it's profitable, but I do know that like you look at the Union Kitchen model and the Union Market model where they combine like the incubator and the market together, and they get a lot of foot traffic over there, and it's become very popular, especially amongst millennials and stuff like that. I think like that model, the marriage between the market and the incubator is it's pretty cool, and I mean here in DC it's pretty popular. So like maybe we can duplicate that and see, if it's brings more opportunity to people.
Well, we just did it. We just finished 50
Like, I love her.
minutes
She's
of
going like this.
conversation with many more questions to go. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions, but there were some great responses here. And thank you, Jill, Jeremiah, Mailee, and Regina for your efforts today.
Thank you.
Thank you.